It started with a letter, clean font, official seal, and just enough legal jargon to make people believe it was real. But behind that envelope was a lie so big it brought fear, shame, and handcuffs to the front lawns of a peaceful neighborhood. And when one man dared to say no, they tried to ruin his life in front of his daughter. If you believe justice shouldn't belong only to the powerful, then share this story. Speak up. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice to expose the lies hiding behind authority. Maple Glen was the kind of neighborhood people worked their whole lives to reach. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and friendly nods between neighbors. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes freely, mailboxes stood polished, and Saturday mornings smelled like fresh coffee and trimmed grass. James Holloway had lived there for over 12 years. A quiet man in his late 40s, a schoolteacher by trade, and a father to 11-year-old Amara. After losing his wife to cancer, he had poured all his love into his daughter and his home. He kept his yard neat, helped elderly neighbors without being asked, and made sure Amara never felt the absence of a second parent. He wasn't flashy, and he wasn't loud, just a decent man trying to live with dignity. Then one Thursday, everything began to change. The envelope looked professional, navy blue with a golden logo, Lakeside Property Standards Committee. It contained a multi-page letter filled with citations and rules. It stated that due to recent administrative restructuring, Maple Glen now fell under the jurisdiction of a newly activated homeowners association. It included fine amounts, deadlines, and a stern warning: non-compliance could lead to legal action or property liens. James stared at the paper for a long time. Maple Glen had never had an HOA. That was one of the reasons he moved there: no extra fees, no unnecessary control. This letter was the first he'd ever heard of one. Across the street, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Levy, was also reading a similar letter. Her hands shook as she told James she had already paid the $250 compliance fee using the payment portal on the website listed. She didn't want trouble. She thought maybe she'd missed a notice, or that things had changed in her old age and she hadn't kept up. Other neighbors began talking too. Some were annoyed, others resigned. Most didn't question it. The website looked legitimate, the logo appeared on multiple documents, and the letters had legal references that sounded convincing: city codes, maintenance standards, enforcement procedures. James wasn't convinced. He took the letter inside and examined every line. The company wasn't listed in any HOA registry for the county. The envelope didn't have a return address. The phone number led to a robotic menu system with no real person on the other end. When he tried emailing the contact listed, it bounced back as undeliverable. His gut told him something was off. The next day, he called the county clerk's office and asked if an HOA had recently been registered or activated for Maple Glen. The clerk politely informed him that there was no official HOA in place. None had been formed. None were pending. Nothing matched the name, Lakeside Property Standards Committee. That was confirmation. This wasn't real. James typed up a warning email to a few neighbors, advising them not to pay anything until more information came out. He also printed a small flyer and taped it to a community notice board near the mailboxes. No official HOA registered, be cautious of scam mail. Confirm with county office before paying. He thought that might be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. This time it was labeled, Final Warning. It cited James for failure to maintain uniform paint standards, refusal to pay mandatory fees, and community disruption. The language was sharper, more threatening. If he didn't pay within 7 days, the letter warned, enforcement action would be initiated, including possible coordination with law enforcement. James shook his head and tossed it aside. The next morning, a tall man in a tucked-in polo shirt and khakis came walking down his driveway. He wore a laminated badge around his neck that read, Compliance Officer, LPC. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter and claimed he was doing a follow-up inspection on James's property. James asked for ID and legal documentation authorizing him to be on private property. Carter smirked and said, Sir, you've already been warned. You can either get in line or get into trouble. James ordered him off his lawn and told him not to come back without a police escort or a court order. Within hours, things escalated. Mrs. Levy called James in a panic. She had just gotten a visit too. The compliance officer told her she was in good standing, but warned her to watch out for neighbors spreading misinformation. Another family down the block received a threatening voicemail that included a barely veiled comment about CPS getting involved if residents continued to disturb the peace. James sat at his kitchen table that evening, rereading the letters, analyzing the logo, the language, the threats. He knew something wasn't just fake, it was coordinated. It wasn't just a scam, it was a full-blown impersonation of power. Still, he didn't expect what came next. A new letter arrived. It wasn't printed this time, it was handwritten and stuffed under his door. Last chance. Stop interfering. Your daughter doesn't need to see what happens to troublemakers. James froze. That wasn't just fraud now. That was a threat. His protective instincts took over. He contacted the police, filed a report, and provided all the letters and evidence. The responding officer seemed uninterested, brushing it off as a civil issue and saying, if it's a scam, just ignore it. No need to escalate. James insisted it wasn't just mail fraud, someone was showing up at homes, impersonating authority, and using intimidation tactics. The officer shrugged and said there wasn't much they could do unless a crime was committed. He left without taking any copies of the documents. That night, James kept the porch lights on. He didn't tell Amara about the handwritten note, but she noticed the tension in his face. She asked if everything was okay. James smiled gently and told her, everything's fine, baby. Just a bunch of people who think they can scare folks into silence. What he didn't know was that silence wasn't their goal. They wanted submission. And if they couldn't get it voluntarily, they'd try to force it, no matter who was watching. 3 days after the handwritten threat, James Holloway was preparing breakfast for Amara when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, 2 uniformed officers stood there. One of them asked him to step outside. The tone wasn't friendly. James calmly asked what this was about. The taller officer informed him that he was being placed under arrest for obstruction, harassment, and trespassing. Before he could finish asking for clarification, they moved in and began placing cuffs on his wrists. Amara stood frozen in the kitchen, holding her juice box, watching as her father was taken from their home without a warrant, without an explanation. She cried out, but James tried to stay calm. He told her to stay inside and call their neighbor, Mrs. Levy. By the time Mrs. Levy arrived, the police were already driving away with James in the back seat of the cruiser. Amara was trembling. Levy comforted her and promised to stay with her until James came back. At the station, James demanded to know who had filed the complaint. He was told the charges had come from a registered community authority, Lakeside Property Standards Committee. According to the report, James had harassed an officer, refused lawful orders, and created a pattern of threatening behavior. The filing included manipulated security footage, grainy, selectively edited clips showing James raising his voice and pointing at the supposed compliance officer, but not showing the threatening notes, nor Carter trespassing on his property. James asked for a lawyer. The desk sergeant smirked and told him he could make one phone call once booking was done. But booking took hours. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. Meanwhile, word had spread through Maple Glen. Some neighbors believed James had gone too far. Others were horrified. A few started to ask questions. Why was James arrested for speaking out against an HOA that no one could confirm was even real? Mrs. Levy posted on a local forum that she had once been afraid to speak up, but now knew something was terribly wrong. She shared the flyers James had made and attached a copy of the county clerk's confirmation that no HOA existed. The post was shared dozens of times. Then hundreds. Then it made its way to a community activist in the next town over who ran a TikTok account exposing housing scams and abuses of power. Within 12 hours, James's story was online, condensed into a 90-second video with screenshots of the letters, the arrest, and photos of James with Amara at her school play. The caption read, "Black father arrested for questioning fake HOA. Neighbors silent. Daughter watched it happen." The video went viral. By the time James was finally allowed to make his phone call, his story had over 2 million views. A civil rights lawyer named Dana Myers reached out directly to Mrs. Levy and offered her services pro bono. When James was released on bail the next morning, Dana was waiting for him. He didn't understand what had happened until she showed him the footage, the news coverage, the online comments. The internet had erupted in outrage. Journalists, legal experts, and homeowners from across the country were now watching. The next days brought more revelations. The Lakeside Property Standards Committee wasn't just fake, it was part of a larger shell operation used to exploit non-HOA neighborhoods in various counties. They had registered websites with official-looking language, hired actors to pose as officers, and manipulated police reports using template filings that sounded legitimate. But it wasn't just a scam. It was fraud with the assistance, knowingly or not, of real police departments. In James's case, it was later revealed that Officer Palmer, the arresting officer, had accepted a consultation fee from a man named Thomas Carter, the same one who had posed as a compliance officer. Carter was no official. He had been previously investigated for impersonating a housing inspector in another state. But charges were dropped there when residents backed down out of fear. James refused to back down. Under Dana Meyer's guidance, he filed a lawsuit against Carter, the fictitious HOA, and the local police department for wrongful arrest, defamation, emotional distress, and aiding a fraudulent scheme. Amara's school organized a rally in support of her father. Students held signs that read, "Truth over tactics," and "Protect our families, not fake power." Parents began digging through their own documents and realized many had paid similar compliance fees without question. Local officials were forced to respond. The mayor released a vague statement about the need for due process and law enforcement integrity. The police department launched an internal investigation. But for most people watching, it was too little, too late. The system had allowed a fabricated organization to operate with impunity until it targeted someone who refused to be silent. James became a reluctant public figure. Interview requests came in from major news outlets. People shared their own stories. A veteran in Arizona who was fined $500 for flying a flag too high, a single mom in Georgia evicted by a non-existent board. James made it clear he wasn't interested in fame. He just wanted justice, not just for himself, but for every person too afraid to speak out. Carter was eventually arrested in a sting operation 2 towns over when he attempted to deliver another citation to an elderly couple. In his car were dozens of fake badges, blank HOA letterheads, and pre-filled fine slips with various county names. The case against the police department was harder. Officer Palmer claimed he had acted on credible documents and had no knowledge the HOA was fake. But text messages surfaced showing he had been warned by another officer that this one might not be real. He ignored it. James's civil case gained traction when video evidence and emails proved there had been multiple failures, from the lack of verification to the misuse of police authority. Dana filed for a full trial. Meanwhile, Amara's quiet strength had made her a symbol of the movement. A clip of her speaking at the school rally, where she said, "No little girl should watch her dad get arrested for telling the truth," circulated widely. Her words touched hearts. Donations poured in to help the Holloways with legal fees, though most were redirected by James to a new fund, Neighbors First, a nonprofit created to educate homeowners on housing scams and legal rights. James eventually returned to teaching, though his schedule was reduced to part-time. He spent his mornings organizing workshops, speaking at town halls, and consulting with legal advocates to push for a new law, the Holloway Act, legislation to prevent fraudulent HOA enforcement, increase penalties for impersonation of authority, and require law enforcement verification of civil documents before arrest. 6 months after the arrest, the law passed in 2 counties. Then 3. Then 5. It was adopted statewide the following year. And in the heart of Maple Glen, the notice board where James had once taped his warning now held a plaque, engraved with these words. When fake power knocked, he said no. When justice slept, he woke it up. To James Holloway, a father, a neighbor, a voice that couldn't be silenced. The courtroom was packed. Not just with reporters or curious townspeople, but with residents from cities across the state. People who had received fake notices, threats, and citations. People who'd been bullied by invisible HOAs and cornered by corrupt officials. They came wearing buttons with "HOAs are not above the law" and shirts that said, "I stand with Holloway." James sat quietly at the plaintiff's table next to Dana Myers as the judge called the first session of Holloway versus Carter et al. To order. The lawsuit named Thomas Carter as the primary defendant and included the Lakeside Property Standards Committee as a fraudulent entity. Also named were Officer Matthew Palmer and the Maple Glen Police Department, accused of false arrest, abuse of authority, and collusion with a known fraudster. The stakes were high, but the evidence was overwhelming. Dana presented official documents showing that the so-called HOA had no legal registration, business license, or any recognition at the county or state level. She introduced video footage from Carter's previous inspections, showing a clear pattern of behavior, fake warnings, aggressive follow-ups, and forged citations. Witnesses testified that Carter had demanded payments under threat of liens and used a badge to give the impression he had legal authority. One elderly man admitted to paying $1,200 in bogus fees over the last year, too afraid to challenge what he thought was a real HOA. The most damning moment came when text messages between Officer Palmer and Carter were revealed. In them, Carter casually joked about bagging another one, while Palmer responded with a laughing emoji. A second message read, "I'll make it look official on my end, don't worry." The courtroom gasped. It was the proof Dana had hoped for, collusion between law enforcement and a private fraudster. Palmer's defense tried to claim that he was misled and believed Carter represented a valid HOA. But the texts contradicted that. Furthermore, Palmer had failed to verify the HOA's existence, had not followed due process in arresting James, and had actively discouraged fellow officers from questioning the legitimacy of Carter's authority. Dana's closing statement focused on the simple truth: this case was never just about James. It was about how easily systems meant to protect people could be twisted to harm them. She spoke of Amara, of neighbors silenced by fear, and of the growing epidemic of private control disguised as civic order. The jury took 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. James Holloway was awarded $2.1 million in damages, $750,000 from Carter for fraud and emotional harm, $1 million in punitive damages against the Maple Glen Police Department, and an additional $350,000 from Officer Palmer personally. More than money, the verdict was a message. It signaled that the abuse of neighborhood power would no longer be tolerated, and that complicity by law enforcement would be punished. The ruling set off a wave of reforms. County offices across the state launched audits of every registered HOA. Over 90 were flagged for review. 17 were deregistered within weeks. Legislators introduced new language into the Holloway Act, expanding protections for homeowners, requiring police departments to create a verification process before executing civil arrest orders, and mandating community education programs. But the real change came from the people. Inspired by James's courage, communities began organizing. In cities like Camden, Durham, and Little Rock, groups formed to monitor HOA abuse and report fraudulent activity. A national database of recognized HOAs was created by a coalition of nonprofits, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development took notice. James, who had returned to teaching part-time, now spent much of his year on the road, speaking at schools, neighborhood associations, and advocacy groups. Amara often traveled with him, shy at first, but growing more confident. She would sit quietly in the front row until it was her turn to speak. Then she'd step to the mic and say what she had said so simply months ago: no little girl should watch her dad get arrested for telling the truth. Her words would silence rooms. Adults cried. People lined up afterward just to say thank you. Despite the attention, James remained humble. He declined interviews from national networks. He didn't want a documentary deal. Instead, he focused on the Neighbors First initiative, which had grown into a nationwide nonprofit with over 200 volunteers and 4 full-time staff. They offered legal workshops, free consultations, and worked with law students to draft legislation against residential fraud. Dana Myers was appointed to a state task force on residential rights. She credited James with inspiring her to rethink the legal system's blind spots. Together, they pushed for federal legislation that mirrored the Holloway Act, and a U.S. senator agreed to sponsor it. Thomas Carter was sentenced to 4 years in prison after pleading guilty to fraud, impersonation, and unlawful gain. His courtroom apology rang hollow. James did not attend the sentencing. He said he had already moved on. Officer Palmer was fired from the police department and lost his appeal to regain his badge. He faced further civil suits from other residents who had been similarly mistreated. Palmer's downfall became a symbol of unchecked local power meeting the force of truth. Back in Maple Glen, changes were visible. Real community councils were formed with open elections and oversight. Yard inspections were replaced with volunteer maintenance groups. Families who had once lived in fear of compliance officers now planted gardens and hosted block parties. The fear was gone. So was the silence. 1 year after the verdict, the town held its first Community Justice Day. James and Amara were honored as keynote speakers. On that sunny spring afternoon, Amara spoke to a crowd of hundreds. Sometimes people pretend to have power. Sometimes even the real ones get it wrong. But if you know the truth, and you say it out loud, you're stronger than all of them. James hugged her afterward, his eyes wet. She was only 10, but she had seen more injustice, and more courage, than most people saw in a lifetime. James never stopped teaching. He began offering a class called Civic Truth, a hybrid of history, government, and critical thinking. It became one of the school's most popular electives. Parents began requesting that their children be placed in Mr. Holloway's class. Not just because he taught them facts, but because he taught them how to stand up. 10 years after the arrest, Amara graduated high school with honors and announced she would study law. Her acceptance essay to Harvard began with the line, "I was 8 years old when the police took my father away for telling the truth. I was 9 when the jury told them to bring him back. I've been listening ever since." James sat in the front row at her graduation, proud, tearful, and humbled by the journey that had begun with a single knock on his door and ended in a courtroom filled with truth. The story of James Holloway became required reading in civic studies across several states. His name was printed in textbooks, not as a politician or a revolutionary, but as something more powerful, a father who stood between his family and injustice, and didn't flinch. The Holloway case didn't just transform Maple Glen. It started conversations in Washington. Within months of the verdict, clips of Amara's words during town hall meetings and community justice rallies had gone viral. Her quiet conviction pierced through political noise, igniting debates on national news panels. Civil rights organizations, housing policy experts, and constitutional lawyers began to gather under a common message: the unchecked power of fake HOAs and local enforcement agencies had to be reined in before more lives were disrupted. State senators in 5 different jurisdictions submitted bills modeled on the Holloway Act, but the biggest leap came when the Justice Department launched an inquiry into the broader phenomenon of private groups assuming governmental roles without oversight. A task force was created to investigate how fraudulent HOAs were operating, how law enforcement was being used to intimidate residents, and why the system had no checks in place to stop it. At the center of it all, James Holloway was called to testify before Congress. James sat under oath, facing a bipartisan panel of lawmakers. He told them what happened the day he was arrested for questioning a bogus citation. He shared how his daughter's scream echoed in his ears for months, how the psychological toll nearly broke him, and how he'd learned to fight back, not with anger, but with action. His words were measured, grounded in truth, and absent of bitterness. The room was still when he finished. Amara, seated in the front row, held up the same handmade sign she once brought to City Hall: "Dads don't belong in handcuffs for telling the truth." The testimony led to the proposal of the Federal Residential Oversight and Rights Enforcement (FROR) Act, a landmark piece of legislation designed to prevent exactly what happened to James from happening again. It aimed to create a national registry of legitimate homeowners associations, require transparency in their operations, and penalize impersonation of government functions. It also mandated police training to distinguish civil matters from criminal ones and protected citizens from unlawful arrest based on private complaints without legal merit. But with progress came resistance. Private real estate lobbying groups argued that the bill was an overreach, claiming it threatened property values and neighborhood autonomy. A coalition of conservative political commentators framed the Holloway Act as anti-policing and used James's story to stir ideological division. Some called him an instigator. A few fringe outlets even accused him of orchestrating the entire event for political gain. James didn't respond to any of it. Instead, he continued building what he'd started. The Neighbors First network expanded to over 40 states. The organization's legal wing filed lawsuits on behalf of residents who had faced similar injustices, including a disabled veteran in Arizona whose home was nearly seized over fabricated violations, and a single mother in Georgia fined for building a wheelchair ramp for her son. Each case further exposed the cracks in the system and made the case for reform undeniable. Amara, now in college, took up the charge with her own voice. Her activism evolved. She began writing op-eds, appearing on educational panels, and participating in student-led policy conferences. Her essay, HOAs, Handcuffs, and My Father's Hands, was published in The Atlantic, and her TED Talk, titled When Small Lies Were Badges, was viewed over 4 million times in 6 weeks. She never sought fame. She sought understanding, and laws that made understanding matter. As public pressure mounted, the FROR Act gained traction. It passed in the House by a narrow margin. The Senate vote was even closer. In the final week of debate, a last-minute effort by lobbyists nearly derailed the bill. One senator held a press conference denouncing the legislation as anti-freedom and government overcorrection. But on the morning of the final vote, a bipartisan group of senators held their own press event. One read aloud from Amara's Atlantic article. Another cited the fraud statistics uncovered by the Holloway legal team. The bill passed by 2 votes. The president signed it into law at a quiet ceremony. James and Amara stood beside her as she signed the document into existence. The moment was not celebrated with confetti or music. It didn't trend on social media for long. But it shifted the landscape permanently. Within a year, over 300 fraudulent HOA entities had been flagged nationwide. Many dissolved. Others tried to adapt but were brought under legal review. For the first time in U.S. history, homeowners had a digital resource to verify any neighborhood organization's legitimacy. Police departments in every state received training on civil rights compliance in residential enforcement. A hotline was established, staffed by attorneys and advocates, to help people facing harassment by unrecognized neighborhood associations. James returned home to Maple Glen quietly. He didn't want a parade or a documentary. He wanted to garden, walk his dog, and finish his second book, The Law Outside the Law: How Power Pretends. He was still teaching part-time, but now he guest lectured at law schools too. The very institutions that once intimidated him now welcomed him as a moral compass. Amara, interning at a civil rights legal firm in D.C., stayed in close contact with her father. Their bond was unshakable. What began as a nightmare in front of their driveway had become a movement. A legal revolution. A generational wake-up call. Years later, when Amara took the bar exam, she carried a photo of her father in her wallet, not from a courtroom or award ceremony, but from a day in the park when she was 5, holding his hand. It reminded her that the fight for justice doesn't begin in law books or end in courtrooms. It starts when someone ordinary decides they won't back down. The Holloway story became part of legal history, studied in law schools as a precedent-setting example of civil accountability. Housing law professors called it the most important residential rights case since Shelley versus Kramer. Civil liberties organizations cited it as proof that community resilience could dismantle entrenched abuse. It wasn't the story of a politician, activist, or celebrity. It was a story about a father who stood firm and a daughter who believed in him. Every year on the anniversary of the arrest, Maple Glen hosts the Holloway Freedom Walk, a community celebration not of one man, but of the rights he defended. Children wear shirts that say, "Tell the truth, even when they don't want you to." The town that once arrested James now honored him. The place that once tried to silence Amara now amplified her voice. Justice didn't come easily. It didn't come quickly. But it came, because someone refused to accept silence, because a child believed in fairness, and because a nation, eventually, listened. The years that followed the passing of the FROR Act marked a period of reflection and reckoning in American neighborhoods. Across suburbs, inner cities, and rural enclaves, families began to re-examine the systems that governed them without consent. Town meetings once sparsely attended became standing-room-only events. Residents asked sharper questions, demanded documentation, and learned the difference between community stewardship and coercive control. What had begun on a quiet street in Maple Glen now lived in homeowner guides, tenant rights pamphlets, and civic textbooks across the country. James Holloway, though no longer in the spotlight, became something of a national elder in the community justice movement. Universities invited him not for ceremonial honors, but for wisdom. He lectured on power structures, taught policy students about the weaponization of soft law, and mentored a new generation of advocates focused not just on race or class but on structural accountability at every level. His personal life remained modest. He still wore his old watch, kept Amara's childhood drawings in his wallet, and tended to a small backyard vegetable patch in the same house where it all began. But it was Amara whose impact grew most striking. As she passed the bar and began her legal career, she chose to specialize in constitutional civil liberties with a focus on residential governance. She founded the Holloway Civil Accountability Fellowship, which funded young lawyers and researchers committed to defending communities against shadow enforcement bodies and false authority. Each year, the fellowship reviewed over 10,000 applicants. Only 12 were selected. They came from tribal nations, immigrant communities, factory towns, and coastal cities. What they shared was resolve, the kind James once lit with a single protest sign in his daughter's hands. Amara didn't stop there. Her first major case involved a class action suit against a private security company contracted by a wealthy HOA in Southern California. The company had been accused of unlawfully detaining delivery drivers and threatening tenants with fabricated citations. Amara's team won not only damages for the plaintiffs but forced the entire state to review the scope of authority granted to privatized neighborhood security. The ruling became known as Holloway II, and it became mandatory reading in law school property and civil procedure courses. As her influence grew, Amara was asked to serve on the Federal Residential Oversight Reform Board, a permanent bipartisan committee created by the FROR Act. Her presence brought both youth and authenticity to a body often criticized for being too technical or disconnected. When bureaucrats argued over definitions, Amara reminded them what unlawful arrest felt like from a child's eyes. When political infighting stalled enforcement improvements, she brought her father's words back into the conversation: steady, principled, impossible to dismiss. She also began publishing essays, blending legal insight with human experience. Her most widely shared piece, The Fine Print and the Handcuffs, explored how neighborhood covenants and power structures often operate in legal gray areas, where consent is assumed and challenge is punished. It was translated into 7 languages and distributed as required reading by tenant unions from Boston to Phoenix. Despite her rising profile, Amara refused to become a figurehead. She remained on the ground, handling pro bono cases for families facing HOA intimidation, attending local town meetings, and offering community legal training sessions. Her work helped disband over 200 fraudulent enforcement bodies masquerading as neighborhood authorities. Families who once lived in fear of late-night knocks or unaccountable fines now hosted picnics, planned block parties, and reconnected with neighbors. The culture had changed. The myth of police peace in American suburbia had cracked open, replaced by real conversations about autonomy, legality, and belonging. Back in Maple Glen, the community had undergone its own transformation. A new town board, elected in the wake of the Holloway case, initiated a transparency ordinance requiring all residential enforcement activity, from citations to arrests, to be reviewed and published quarterly. They disbanded all informal enforcement units. They also invested in a community ombuds office, led by former public defenders, to mediate disputes with fairness and clarity. Where there was once fear, there was now accountability. James watched these changes unfold quietly, often from his porch. He met with community members one-on-one, offering tea, listening, and reminding them that justice isn't a destination but a habit. He declined invitations to run for office, write memoirs, or star in documentaries. He told journalists that if they wanted to understand what really changed America, they should talk to Amara. And still, the work wasn't over. A new wave of challenges emerged: tech-driven enforcement apps, corporate landlords forming pseudo-HOAs through management companies, and AI tools flagging non-compliant behaviors based on biased data. What once arrived in printed notices now appeared in digital dashboards, giving landlords the illusion of legal omniscience. Amara's team took up the next frontier: digital accountability in residential law. They filed suits against companies selling surveillance data to neighborhood associations, and she co-authored a paper titled Virtual Borders: When Technology Becomes the New Gatekeeper. The paper triggered hearings in Congress and sparked a multi-agency probe into privacy violations. Lawmakers again turned to the Holloways, this time, to ask how justice could evolve without losing its soul in the face of innovation. James responded by publishing a short essay titled "The Algorithm Can't See Character," reminding readers that no code, no matter how advanced, should ever be allowed to replace empathy, context, or due process. Amara eventually launched a nonprofit called Right to Stay, offering legal protections for renters and homeowners across all 50 states, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods. The organization grew rapidly. Within 3 years, it had trained over 5,000 neighborhood legal advocates. These weren't just lawyers, they were teachers, nurses, postal workers, retirees. Everyday people who'd learned how to use their voice and the law together. The Holloway family had become a legacy, not because of celebrity or wealth, but because they made it impossible to ignore the invisible structures that had controlled millions for decades. They had turned a wrongful arrest into a national reckoning. They had made laws out of tears. They had built institutions from quiet conviction. On the 10th anniversary of James's arrest, the Department of Justice hosted a commemorative summit called One Step Past the Driveway. The title referenced the distance between injustice at home and change in the world. Amara was the keynote speaker. Her speech ended not with applause, but with silence, the kind that comes when people feel the weight of what they've heard and don't want to break it. She closed with these words: "We don't need louder laws. We need laws that listen. Because every time you ignore the powerless, you build the next abuse in silence." As the room stood in quiet unity, it was clear that the Holloway story had not ended, it had evolved. Into courtrooms and classrooms. Into ordinances and organizing. Into the very fabric of what it meant to have a home in America, free from fear. They thought they could silence one man with a fake HOA rulebook and a pair of handcuffs, but what they didn't expect was that his arrest would awaken a fire in his daughter and spark a movement no one could stop. On a quiet driveway in Maple Glen, James Holloway stood alone, until the world started paying attention. Injustice knocked on one family's door, and when they answered, they didn't just fight back, they changed the law. From neighborhood threats to national headlines, this wasn't just about property lines or fines, it was about power, truth, and who gets to say what justice looks like. Today, communities across the country stand a little taller because one father refused to bow, and one daughter turned heartbreak into hope. If their story moved you, if you believe authority should serve people, not silence them, then don't let it end here. Like, share, subscribe. Because justice begins at the front door.